and his understanding of the cross of Christ. And I was thinking of Girard the other day. I'd done some lectures here at the house on Girard, and it occurred to me the sense in which we need to set Girard in a larger category and, in fact, understand what he's doing in a biblical understanding with the Jews from a broader perspective. And so tonight, Frank and I are we're going to lay out just a little bit what Girard is doing, and then we're going to try to develop this and take it places that, as far as I know, that has not people have not used or taken Girard in the way that we're looking to develop it. But Frank, give us a bit of a rundown on the significance of René Girard.
He's approaching reading, well, first of all, culture, and then also the Bible. And it's kind of taking an anthropological, sociological, philosophical, historical approach.
Everything.
Yeah, kind of everything melded together, which makes him interesting. And really his theory, it's very simple, but I think very profound. I think has a lot of explanatory power. And what he compares it to himself, he says, just as natural selection would explain the diversity of species, so mimetic desire and rivalry counts for the diversity of culture.
Let's pause there. I think this is a really significant point you're bringing out here. That just as within, that what Darwin thought that he had discovered in natural selection was the key to everything, Girard is saying the same thing about his discovery. And whether you agree completely with him, I think that no one would disagree that he has opened a door into myth and culture and explanations of it. He's given us a mechanism that, as far as I know, there is no tool or mechanism or idea that can open this door in the way that René Girard has.
Yeah, and at the time he was, beginning his work and publishing his material, the idea that imitation was foundational or at least largely significant neurologically or psychologically, it was not very well accepted at the time. Towards the later end of his career, though, there's been quite an accumulation of research and studies that support the idea of imitation being pretty central to human nature. And so he's going to use this term mimetic, and it just basically means imitation. All right, and so he's got four basic claims. One, that there's mimetic desire. All human desires are borrowed from each other, and those desires operate in a feedback loop. Two, mimetic rivalry. All human conflict originates in mimetic desire. Three, the scapegoat or victimage mechanism is the origin of sacrifice and the foundation of human culture, which is necessary for humanity to control the violence that arises from mimetic rivalry. And fourth, and perhaps the most interesting one, the Bible exposes the previous ideas and denounces the scapegoat mechanism.
Let's go back through each of your four steps there and see if we can lay out a little bit the meaning, and begin then with mimesis, or the idea that desire is a learned thing, that a child is going to desire, and you see this with children playing in a room, that if there's a room full of toys and there's two children, what toy does the kid want to play with? Well, he wants to play with the toy that the other kid is playing with. That is, that what makes something valuable is that another desires it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I having read this, I've used this on my children to get them to eat food that they don't want to eat, and it works perfectly.
He's using the Oedipus here, and so Girard is very familiar with Freudian theory. But, where Freud talked about the Oedipus complex, and in the Oedipus complex, the child takes his father as his model. In other words, he wants to be his father. And Freud reads this, as he did in early Freud anyway, in a very sexual way, that the child, if he's going to be the father, then he has to marry his mother and, of course, displace the father. But I think what Girard is saying is that he's taking out the sexual element of it and just saying that desire or mimesis is not necessary. It's not necessarily a sexual thing. In fact, it is more basic to human development even than sexuality.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he's doing. He's not unique in presenting the idea of imitation or mimetic desire. That's happened long before him. What's unique to Girard is saying that all human desire and all violence is originating in this. And he'll even say all culture, it's the foundation of culture, is this imitation and mimetic desire. He even goes so far as to say that if you were to somehow cease all imitation, that culture would cease to exist.
Because it's the desire that, by its very nature, draws people together. Is that the idea?
Or puts them apart.
Yeah, or it kills them. Yeah, that splits them.
Yeah.
So it is both the founding aspect and the destructive aspect. Even though Girard comes late to Scripture, you can just see him opening the early chapters of Genesis, thinking that he was going to find more mythology, and then reading that. And what you get, I think, in a deep reading, even of the temptation, that the original temptation is not without its mimesis. That is, that Satan himself is one who, or the serpent at least in the garden, is the idea of demonstrating or invoking, and then it is like a plague, that once Eve partakes. And then you go to Cain and Abel, that what Cain wants is what Abel has. And it's not clear exactly what that is, other than that he's acceptable to God. So this mimetic rivalry, he will find again and again in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Let's go to let's unless you had something else. Let's go to your point two there.
Okay. So that's mimetic rivalry, that all human conflict originates in mimetic desire. Yeah, so basically he's just saying that this conflict that comes out of imitation and desiring what the other desires is what causes all human conflict, at least in its original sense. In other words, if it weren't for desiring what someone else had, there would be no human conflict.
And Girard, it's always interesting to me that Girard, you can tie him directly into Freud, Lacan, Zizek. What's happening in psychoanalytic understanding is that part of what is necessary for desire to arise, first of all, that desire is lacking. In other words, that you desire something that you do not have by definition. So that desire arises with both mimesis, imitation, but also as an obstacle. In other words, in the Oedipus complex, the child wants to be the father, marry the mother, but the one that is the model is also the obstacle. What Freud does with that is the idea that every child wants to kill his father and marry his mother, at least male children. He didn't have much to say about female children, but again, I think Girard creates a more universal understanding of this, and it's there in Lacan and Zizek too, that it's almost the obstacle, the idea of a rivalry, is the very key ingredient to the desire. Thinking here of, medieval knights fighting over the lady, in waiting that's up on the balcony, really, that the interesting thing becomes the rivalry. The rivalry then seems to become the focus, and the object cause of desire is fluid. It could be anything. You could attach on to tulips that, thinking here of the Dutch, selling tulips for thousands, that any object potentially, given the right obstacle. And of course, here, I think the idea of a zero-sum game plays into this. That part of desire is that there's only so much of whatever there's not an abundance there is a limited supply. It's a zero-sum game. That whatever one person has is at the expense of another.
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of interesting. Note that where Girard started was actually in medieval literature. That was one of his first studies, I believe.
Yeah, maybe that's that we need to bring that out. That he's a literary specialist,
Yeah,
and what he's finding in the great literary works is always mimesis, and then mimetic rivalry, and then a triangulation. That is, that there is always this rivalry over an object. And I think he claims it's there in Shakespeare, in the great literature. I think he's actually a Shakespeare specialist, but he specialized in several things. But he kept finding the same thing over and over. And of course, the idea is that great fiction is actually built upon fundamental universal truths.
yeah. Even in the Genesis account there in the garden, God becomes the rival in a sense because it's his knowledge that he's not willing to share. That you have to disobey him in order to access what he has. So I think that model is definitely pervasive, and I think Girard is really onto something fairly interesting.
It's interesting, as you said, that strikes me that if you think of a Kantian philosophy, that in a sense, that Kant reproduces the idea in the phenomena and the noumena. The noumena is in some way always that thing that we cannot attain. It's the key to everything, and you cannot get it. The whole system, this is the driving aspect, not only of philosophy, but I think that we'll see the same thing when we come to talk about the Jews and how that historically they have been the scapegoat, or that Jesus is the fundamental, scapegoat. It's the same thing, that there is something there in the scapegoat. It is a thing that would be attained but cannot. It's absent. It's not readily available. But anyway, that just evoked that thought there. Now that was point two. What's point three?
So the third thing is the scapegoat or victimage mechanism. And of course, obviously, scapegoat, he's taking that from Leviticus there, the Yom Kippur, with the two goats there, the one that's driven out into the desert is the scapegoat. But what he's saying is that, the Jewish scapegoat and ultimately Christ, as he kind of becomes the ultimate scapegoat, it's prototypical of what's happening everywhere else. And his point is that the Jewish literature is exposing this mechanism, whereas the other cultures are unconsciously continuing to participate in it without realizing what they're doing. And basically what he's saying is that what will happen, the result of the first two things, the mimetic desire and then the mimetic rivalry, is that at some point, as more and more of this mimesis is occurring, there will be so much competition and so much violence and so much human conflict that culture or that group will just be at the brink of utter chaos and self-destruction. And so what will happen is somebody will need to get blamed. Somebody will need to become the target of all the violence of the culture as a whole, whether it's everybody picking up stones for a stoning or whether it's one person acting on behalf of the mob. They will immolate or lynch this person in order to satisfy the chaos, the competition in that society. And I've got a little quote here where he explains it a little bit. He says, "In many rituals, everyone assembled is required to participate in an immolation that might easily be mistaken for a sort of lynching. Even when the sacrifice is performed by a single person, that person usually acts in the name of everyone involved. The community affirms its unity in the sacrifice, a unity that emerges from the moment when the division is most intense, when the community enacts its dissolution in the mimetic crisis, and its abandonment of the endless cycle of vengeance. But suddenly the opposition of everyone against everyone else is replaced by the opposition of all against one. Where previously there had been a chaotic ensemble of particular conflicts, there is now the simplicity of a single conflict. The entire community is on one side, and on the other, the victim."
So this brings out several things, and the idea here that everybody does it, but nobody does it. And this may be part of the next step, but the idea is how did this person die? What, was he murdered? Was he killed? Well, in a sense, no one did it. Even if someone, even if he's saying, even a particular individual carries it out, he doesn't carry this out in and through his own willpower, but on behalf of the group. And I think usually what you see in a stoning, or if a group of people stab someone, no one individual can be held culpable. And then later, of course, they'll say, well, in fact, there was no murder. It never happened. That it brings the group together. And, there's nothing like bringing a group together who they can have as an enemy. In fact, that tends to be definitive, I think. I used to teach in Japan, and in Japan, they almost consciously seem to use scapegoating, because every little class of people would be broken up. It was on the 7 village system. They would have one classroom, then it would be broken up into groups of 7. If I think it was 7, but it was inevitable that in any classroom there would be a scapegoat. And sometimes, the child might be just a little bit odd, or not. You never know. This is the point about the Jew. Those Jews, they're especially tricky because they look just like us, they speak our language, they dress just like us, but that means that they're even more, seductive and insidious. Sort of the German take on, the Nazi take on the Jews. So the scapegoat, historically, it might be slaves or it might be children that would be sacrificed. It might be someone who's diseased. Girard refers to an Aztec myth in which there's the little pustule-covered one who they clearly have sacrificed to keep the sun rising. And it indicates that maybe he had leprosy or some sort of skin disease. The focus of the violence then on the scapegoat, you think of the boys that went in and shot the children at Columbine. The boys, I think they were bullied, but they didn't go and shoot the bullies. They just went in and shot everybody. That is, that in this random anger, the rage is blind. But in the scapegoat, then suddenly the violence is directed upon a singular victim. And I think isn't that the key mechanism there?
Yeah, I got a little quote here about that. And what he'll say, the culture, the people that are doing this are not necessarily aware of what they're doing. It's more or less something that just kind of has to happen, at least as far as the group as a whole. Now, there might be a couple people kind of directing it that know this. I think you see this with the high priest and Caiaphas with Jesus. They say, isn't it right that one man should die for the sake of the people? Now, I think there might be some leaders who are kind of instigating to the event that know what they're doing, but the group as a whole might not understand it. And what Girard explains happening in the long run is that over time, it's going to be forgotten that this person was murdered. There's going to be recognition that this person actually saved the culture, not necessarily from anything real, but from the rivalry and the violence that was spinning out of control. And so there will be some kind of mythology built up around this person and this event. And he explains that all of the rituals and the sacrifices, the myths that we have, where people have sacrificed themselves, were probably actually lynched in one of these events, the mimetic crisis event like this.
I happen to have a quote here. All the dissensions, rivalries, jealousies, and quarrels within the community, the sacrifices are designed to suppress them. The purpose of the sacrifice is to restore harmony to the community, to reinforce the social fabric. Everything else derives from that. If once we take this fundamental approach to sacrifice, choosing the road that violence opens before us, we can see that there is no aspect of human existence foreign to the subject, not even material prosperity. When people no longer live in harmony with one another, the sun still shines and the rain falls, to be sure, but the fields are less well tended, the harvest less abundant. This is from Violence in the Sacred. That literally the culture can't hold together.
Yeah. And I think, Girard himself, he poses a question here, because seeing this happen again and again throughout all cultures, all history. It is something that is just basic human nature, that we fall into this mechanism here. And so he asked the question, how is it that such unity against the victim is possible in so many diverse rituals? What force unites the collective against the victim? He's got an answer here. And I think it's kind of frightening if we realize what he's saying, because it puts us all, no matter how moral or modern and secular or whatever we consider ourselves to be, beyond this simple mythological mob event, we are just as likely to fall into this. And he explains, the idea that a group would gather to immolate any sort of victim in order to commemorate the guilt they still feel for a prehistoric murder is purely mythical. What is not purely mythical, by contrast, is the idea that men would immolate victims because an original, spontaneous murder had in fact unified the community and put an end to the real mimetic crisis. There would be no contradiction in intent between prohibitions and rituals. Prohibitions attempt to avert the crisis by prohibiting those behaviors that provoke it. And if the crisis recurs nonetheless, or threatens to do so, ritual then attempts to channel it in a direction that would lead to resolution, which means a reconciliation of the community at the expense of what one must suppose to be an arbitrary victim. In fact, no individual victim can ever be responsible for a mimetic crisis.
So explain then the way that we're going from the scapegoating mechanism. Describe then how there is the deification of the victim.
Well, I don't know that I have a really neat way to sum that up. At least the way I think he explains it is that the guilt of the culture doing this, having realized that the victim was innocent, that they try to sugarcoat the event to make that person out to be the hero.
This is, if you read myth, and you can usually see this part of it. In other words, myth, first of all, is very strange. That in the Aztec myth, it's the council of the gods, and one of the gods volunteers to be the sun. And of course, what you're talking about is they probably burned him up, or threw him in the volcano or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's a Native American myth that this is the founding myth. A woman has intercourse with a dog and gives birth to 6 puppies. Her tribe banishes her, and she is forced to hunt for her own food. One day, as she returns from the bush, she discovers that the puppies are children and that they shed their animal skins the moment she leaves the house. So she pretends to leave, and when her children are, as it were, undressed, she takes their skins away, forcing them to keep their human identity from now on. The woman becomes a great goddess, punishing bestiality, incest, and all other society's rules. It's a kind of a summation of a typical myth. First of all, that in some way, and this ties into Freud too, that the primordial myth, or the original horde in Freud's picture, that you have the sons who are without wives because their father in some way is keeping all the women for himself. And the sons then gather together and kill the father and eat him, and Freud says, of course they eat him. And what becomes the founding moment of the culture is precisely the thing that is forbidden. There is the sense in these myths, and if you go and you look at carnival or other aspects of cultures, that when people wear masks, it is a period in which people either can ritualistically be transgressive, or actually transgressive. That during carnival you can do all kinds of transgressive things. And of course, in the myth, the idea is that the woman in some way transgressed. If you know something about Native American peoples, there's the dog people, the wolf people, that they identify, particular clans identify with a particular animal. And so what's being pictured in some way is this founding myth in which the woman is deified because she is the mother goddess of this clan, of this tribe. Now, if you didn't have Girard, I don't know what you would do with a story like that, or how you would read it.
I think it's certainly insightful because it's a unifying theme. We see it happen again and again. the way he's able to see that interpretation is because it's countered and exposed in the biblical literature.
Now, I had, here's a quote on desire. And again, talking about the parallel between Girard and biblical literature. In other words, desire, I think, is very much front and center in a Jewish concept of sin, certainly the Paul's understanding of sin. The desire is not simply, I'm hungry, I desire to eat, but desire is pictured as a kind of primordial drive. And Girard seems to be getting at this. It's not just basic desires or instincts. He says desire chooses its objects through a mediation of the model. It is a desire modeled on the other, yet identical with the intense yearning to reduce everything to oneself. From its inception, desire is divided between the self and the other, who always seems to be superior and more independent than the self. That is, that the self in some way is inadequate, there's a lack. This is in essence the paradox of pride, identical with desire and its inevitable defeat. The model designates the desirable object by desiring it himself. Desiring is always mimetic of another desire, hence desire of the same object, and the inexhaustible source of conflicts and rivalries. The more the model transforms himself into an obstacle, the more desire tends to transform obstacles into models. So there are several just immediate parallels between what Girard is doing. Just he's identifying these key categories: violence, mimetic rivalry, desire, sacrifice, and then the fourth point. Can you explain that one to us?
Yeah, so the fourth point is just that the biblical tradition exposes all of the previous ideas, the mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, and the scapegoat mechanism, and it denounces them. And what he says, this isn't, for him, it culminates in Christ, but it's also throughout the entirety of the biblical narrative, and in particular Jewish people, because obviously the word he's getting, scapegoat, is from Jewish culture. It's from the Day of Atonement. Well, here's a quote. "Certainly there must be, behind the biblical account, myths in conformity with the universal norms of mythology. So the initiative of the Jewish authors and their critical reappraisal must undoubtedly be credited with the affirmation that the victim is innocent and that the culture founded on murder retains a thoroughly murderous character that in the end becomes self-destructive, once the ordering and the sacrificial benefits of the original violence have dissipated." So he's saying a couple things here. One is that the Jewish culture saw, or at least the authors, the authors of the Bible, saw and understood what was happening in these other cultures, but refused to acquiesce to it in their own religious structure and in their own culture. They would never try to mythologize the victim. If someone was murdered or lynched or sacrificed, it was always described as an innocent victim and not portrayed as some kind of voluntary thing. And the other thing that he's saying is that it also exposed cultures that would use the scapegoat mechanism without understanding, and trying to use that as the glue for the culture, will always continue in that violence, and in the end, it will just become self-destructive to the culture. That the scapegoat mechanism is not an adequate way to deal with the violence of a culture. It will not last forever.
So that you're saying that the sacrificial system will break down.
Yeah, in a culture where it's not understood what it is. He'll explain this a little bit more when he's talking about the passion, but I think the misunderstanding, and this is a large part of what I was addressing in my atonement paper, in the communion conversations we've had, that the misunderstanding of the biblical sacrifices is that they actually had some power in themselves. I think they were representations. They were opposing what they had in other cultures. We talked about this before, that the animals that the Jews were told to sacrifice were the ones that would have been revered in Egypt, and the ones that were clean for eating were the ones that would have been sacred in Egypt. And so it's kind of this turning over of the culture they came out of. It wasn't that the God actually intended for the sacrifices to have some effect in solving their societal problems. It was more that they were kind of visceral object lessons. And, it's important to point out that the sacrificial system didn't come about until after they had made the golden calf. So, they were going to revere and worship the calf. And so then God declares that as the clean animal that we're going to sacrifice and eat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the point of it as a whole is not that the Jewish sacrificial system is some kind of ignorant myth, but rather it's an object lesson to drive them away from the type of mythological worship they had come from in Egypt. And what Girard's going to be saying is that, the naive interpretation of a sacrificial system is what will completely prevent you from seeing the real point of the Jewish narrative, and that is that we're not going to lynch the innocent people. We're not going to sacrifice one for the sake of the whole. It's really that the Jewish culture is standing in opposition to the cultures around them. God says, don't give your children to the fire, in reference to Baal. And this is very, very clear in the prophets in particular, where he goes into great detail about how they're imitating the nations around them. And most of the things he's critiquing them for participating in are the parts where they're sacrificing people.
Yeah, I have a quote from, Jeremiah even questioned whether sacrifices originated with God at all. He says, "For in the day that I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this command I gave them, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk only in the way that I command you, so that it may be well with you." That's Jeremiah 7:22 to 23. And of course, that's you could just string out the prophetic critique. Isaiah says, "What it to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." So the picture is the call for love, justice, and not sacrifice. Hosea says, "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offering." So that accords with what you're saying, that the sacrifices, as you said, were a visceral lesson over and against the culture and religion of Egypt.
Right. And perhaps this is actually kind of a good point here to point out one of the critiques of René Girard is that he seems to leave no room for wholesome good imitation. In Girard, it kind of seems, the more you read it, that all imitation is evil. And I'm not sure that's what he's saying. I think he just hasn't covered, or at least in what I've read, he hasn't covered that particular topic. I don't think he's specifically saying that there's no such thing as good imitation. But perhaps part of the problem with the Jewish system is that they didn't have the person of Christ to imitate. They were given a description of a different culture. They're given rituals to kind of reprogram their thinking, but at the same time, they never really had a role model that they could fully imitate to learn how to be a different type of person, to be a different type of culture. And I think that's what is so earth-shattering in what happened with Pentecost and following. Now Peter and John and eventually Paul, they have a person who has demonstrated exactly what that kind of alternative culture is supposed to be. They had a role model. And Paul will later write, "Be your imitators of Christ." Mm. And perhaps part of the reason that as a culture, they never fully were able to embody the law as God intended it. And there's a certain amount of misunderstanding that developed over time. But in the church, we had a much clearer example of what that alternative culture would be, and that we have something worth imitating that will be different than mimetic rivalry.
You had said something earlier, and I wanted to bring it into what you're saying now. Girard referencing a foundation to cultures.
Yeah, that mimetic rivalry is the foundation of all culture.
And what you're describing in that sense, in other words, foundation, a very bloody foundation, a kind of mythical lie, is the foundation of culture.
Hmm.
And that is what Judaism and Christianity is exposing, is the lie that stands behind culture. Now that
Yeah,
sounds strange in a sense, not culture and oh being cultured, but culture in the sense of a tribe, a people, that what causes them to cohere is precisely the thing, that the ignorance, the deception, the violent murder that they in some way have covered up, and that is the very thing that binds them.
yeah.
And then you go on and you've said, but the Jews didn't have this foundation. That's a good foundation not to have, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so what they had, their foundation was a God who brought them out of that, a God who exposed the weakness of the most powerful ruler that they knew. So, rather than covering up and hiding, which we could equate to pride, no, we have everything's laid bare. And that's kind of what you see throughout the Jewish scriptures, is that they're not afraid to talk about their heroes, whether Abraham or David, and let all their flaws be known.
Right, right.
To a degree, I think much further than you get in any other mythology, as far as sacred scripture from other cultures. And so right there, you're already starting with a very different foundation. It's not the foundation of rivalry and pride and hiding, but rather it's a exposure and dealing with it and reconciliation, forgiveness. And ultimately, I think in Christ, what you end up with is also the power of new life and creation, rather than destruction for the sake of control being the founding glue of the culture.
Let's clarify here. We're using this word foundation. And of course, in postmodernity, the critique of foundationalism, they tie this to modernism. There is this parallel then between what Derrida is doing in finding a kind of inherent violence in human culture, language, the law, and Girard is doing in describing how this actually functions. There's a wonderful book, I think it may have been, is it McKenna, that's written on violence and difference, showing the comparison between Girard and Derrida. So we're not using the word foundation in any different sense here. In other words, yes, we do mean, I think, the idea of the foundationalism as you have it in modernity. But even more than that, that every culture in some way is functioning upon this same deceptive foundation. In other words, you could take the cogito apart, the Cartesian cogito, that it's inherently a deception. So that anti-foundationalism, I think people throw that term around, but I think Christianity, as you're describing it, what you're saying, there is this anti-foundationalism as directed against the presumption of culture, of understanding as you have it, but that is then displaced by the foundation that we have in Christ.
Jesus said to Peter, that's the rock on which I'm going to lay my foundation. We have just such a different orientation. It's iconoclastic. We are very much about breaking down the deceptions that culture has built up. That's kind of the whole point. Even Paul, in his, if you want to call it the first apologetic in Athens, right? You all are worshiping what you don't know. And he refers to their poets and is not afraid to say, we have a different answer. We know what you don't understand. He's taking down their whole origin.
That's the New Testament. If rightly understood,
Yeah.
that it is an exposure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Girard, he's got some particularly sharp words for the understanding of, we'll just say an Anselmian understanding of atonement when it comes to the cross. He says, certainly the Passion is presented to us in the Gospels as an act that brings salvation to humanity, but it is in no way presented as a sacrifice. If you have really followed my argument up to this point, you will already realize that from our particular perspective, the sacrificial interpretation of passion must be criticized and exposed as a most enormous and paradoxical misunderstanding, and at the same time as something necessary, and as the most revealing indication of mankind's radical incapacity to understand its own violence, even when that violence is conveyed in the most explicit fashion.
Yeah, this is the great tragedy of what has happened. If Girard is correct, or even if it's not just Girard, I just think if we read the New Testament in this light, that it's not that the New Testament is a duplication of pagan. God, the gods are angry. We have to feed the gods, and that's what you get in sacrifice. That sacrifice, at least in paganism, is always a propitiation in some way. That blood is.
It solves your God problem.
Yeah, yeah, and God is a problem in that, and God is to be feared. I lived in Japan for 20 years, and the religion is religion of fear. The whole thing is built on fear. And what you're doing primarily in the religion is appeasing the gods. You want the gods are pictured as angry. And so unfortunately, I'm aware that we don't want to scapegoat Anselm or Calvin. Maybe they were just the bright thinkers, but they have kind of the prototype then of a Christianity that seems to, at least in Girard's estimate and others' estimate, there is a Christianity that is the point is that no, God is not hungry, demanding sacrifices and demanding blood and angry. That is precisely the thing that was to be exposed in the sacrifice of Christ.
In regard to Anselm and Calvin, maybe it's a little postmodern of me, but I tend to think that most people writing are just kind of revealing the thought of the day, and maybe some are articulating it better than most people understand.
It's just more paganism.
Yeah. I mean, Calvin's following Luther, and Luther's just following Constantinianism.
And you kind of have to look at what these guys did. In other words, in the New Testament, it's not a hard thing to discover what authentic Christianity is. It probably doesn't go about the business of murdering people. Luther is going to encourage the pogroms of against the Jews and even the peasant wars. He's a guy who incorporates violence into his system. Calvin is going to, burn 70 people at the stake. But these forms of Christianity prove themselves wrong just wrong. You don't need to think very long. Yeah, you probably shouldn't be burning and killing and bent upon an anti-Semitic understanding. And so Girard's exposure of the violence is in some way defeated in these systems, that it takes Christianity and just makes it more of the same.
I'm not sure if this is exhaustively correct, but I think every major reformer, Luther, Zwingli, etc., all agreed that the Anabaptists deserved to die.
Everybody wanted to drown the Anabaptists. Yeah, they came together.
On that one point, yeah. On the particular people that wouldn't fight back, so I guess it worked out for them.
This is, Girard's point clear through here, that Christianity, there is a resemblance between myth, the idea of the death of the God and the resurrection. And so, people find that, and among liberals, they say, oh, yeah, the Bible, it's just more myth. Among conservatives, there may be the idea, oh, no, it's completely different. Well, Girard's point is, no, actually, the Bible is following these myths to expose them, to uncover them, that there may be patterns of similarity that is purposeful in this.
If we're to pick one point in Girard to critique, and I mean, you have to understand how he's coming from a very secular position, and from there realizing the legitimacy of the Jewish tradition and Christianity and how it's different from the rest of the world's religions in that it exposes this mechanism. I think he still kind of retains a little bit too much of that secularization, and I don't think that I don't know if he accepts the resurrection or not, or if that is a little too mythological for his taste. But I think, when we're talking about this whole problem of mimetic rivalry, the zero-sum game, the only way to really overcome it, I think Girard, he kind of thinks that in exposing this mechanism, that's enough for culture to overcome it. And so for him, that's what the work of the cross is primarily about. And I do think that's an important part of the cross is exposing this mechanism. But the mechanism had been exposed already through Judaism, and I don't think that's enough. I think what you need more so than that is to remove, this is Freud's death drive thing, right? The angst and the fear of death, which, Paul points out that's what gives the ruler of the world power, is the fear of death. And I think without the hope of resurrection, the idea of recreation, the idea that life is not in limited supply, the hope of new life and resurrection is abundant and available. Without that idea, without that hope, without that faith, without that truth, there's really no way to avoid mimetic rivalry and mimetic crisis. You will always fall back into that. And I think that is kind of what is shown with Luther and Zwingli and the other reformers being willing to sacrifice the Jews or the Anabaptists or anybody else that didn't fit into their paradigm because it was necessary. If you don't have the power of God, which is different than the power of the world, you can't stand against this. Mm-hmm. It's not just understanding it that's what helps you overcome it. It's understanding that there's something more powerful than taking away somebody else's possession.
Mm-hmm. Let me agree with you, but add an addendum to it. That I think you're right, that a criticism that is often made of Girard is that, well, this doesn't explain everything, or this is, here's an example of something where he doesn't cover it. I can absorb that criticism and say, yeah, I don't know that Girard himself, but or certainly people who appreciate Girard don't need to understand that he's giving us an exhaustive explanation of the cross or of anything in that sense, but he's given us a key.
Yeah.
And certainly we need to broaden this out and add to it that to just read Girard as, I think that would be a kind of flat reading in and of itself. But it certainly adds an orb, a facet of understanding that is not otherwise there.
Oh, yeah, I think it's absolutely valuable. I think the two things go together. Without either half of that, I think it's very difficult to really understand what is happening in the cross. But with the two pieces put together, the hope of resurrection and this exposure of this mechanism that the rest of the world is stuck in, really what he's doing is kind of understanding the systemic nature of sin. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he uses the word, but that's really what he's describing is sin.
Yeah, I didn't mention Girard in my blog today, but it sort of fits, that you have a Christianity that's all about escape, and still is an active participant in all the problems of, desire, of the health and wealth gospel. Many of us can see the problem in that. But in a way that much of Christianity is kind of flattened out to obtaining a place in heaven, attaining some future escape as a kind of insurance. And I think that's Girard's critique of traditional atonement theory, that it doesn't get at the real human predicament. Now, whether Girard does himself fully and completely, I think, yeah, probably not. But at least here is the beginning of an idea. I had a couple of things that I thought we could add to this. One thing, there are particular places in the Gospels that are very interesting. The obvious places in the Old Testament, that Joseph and his brothers. If you read that story with Girard in mind, that the brother that they would sacrifice, Joseph, by the end of the story, they would sacrifice themselves for Benjamin.
Yeah. Yep.
You read the story of the wisdom of Solomon, the two prostitutes, and the baby, and Solomon says, yes, let's sacrifice the baby. Let's split it in two. And of course, the authentic mother is the one who would, in fact, relinquish her rights to the child. And once you get this and you see these Old Testament stories, one after another, that clearly the Jews are a people who have an appreciation then, are able to read human desire they are people who have been given revelation. They understand these things on the basis of who God is and the people that they're. And so I think that one of the things that we can see in the Old Testament is that they are able. Think here of Abraham when he's before. It happens two times that Sarah is very beautiful, and Abraham's able to read the king's mind before the king can. Think here of Jacob, that Jacob is the trickster because he can read Esau. He can predict what Esau wants, and he can manipulate him accordingly. This idea of standing outside of desire, of being able to read desire, I think that this is part of the appreciation that Girard has for what's happening in the Old Testament and that is also happening in the great literature of the world. You read somebody like Dostoevsky. I think this is another one that Girard focuses on, that there is this ability to read the human heart in a fashion that is just not available otherwise. And by the way, the idea of modern literature, Western literature, is a development out of a Judeo-Christian insight. Certainly, somebody like Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
Okay, once you've said that, you've said these people, the scapegoating mechanism has been revealed to them. They do not scapegoat, but then they become the scapegoat, right?
Well, if you don't stand with the mob, you're outside the mob.
Part of this is you're kind of treading dangerous ground. You want to say, well, why were those Jews scapegoated? And in any particular period in history, prior to the Enlightenment, they're too fluid, they're too cosmopolitan. They don't have allegiance. And then after the French Revolution, they would be accused of sticking to their religion too much. That is, they would be accused of being poor and ignorant, or of being intellectuals and greedy. That there is no consistency to the anti-Semitism. They kind of became the noumena of the culture. You're talking about that God himself is in some way a mystery, and in a sense that in this noumena, or in this blank spot, you could just put whatever you wanted, because the Jews were in fact not. They would not give allegiance in the way that the various cultures would demand. They would not be caught up in the various revolutions and tribalism. They would always count themselves apart. But then, you get into Nazi Germany. And of course, prior to this, the idea was, well, these Jews, we have to convert them to Christianity. Well, the Nazis are, Hitler's saying just the opposite. Well, they're genetically different. The only answer is genocide. And so there is an evil, the ultimate evil, the Holocaust. I don't know if in the history of the world it gets worse than this, that comes to focus upon the Jews. And I would say that the characteristics then of the Jews are like the characteristics of Christ, that he was accused of being, variously sympathetic to Rome. He was accused of being a wine bibber. He was accused of being demonic. He was, that all of the accusations that might be made of Jews would be made of Jesus. And of course, the exposure there of the entire system. That anti-Semitism, in a strange way, and isn't it strange that a Christianity that is aimed, I think, a New Testament Christianity that is aimed precisely at exposing that sort of anti-Semitism. The idea that in the New Testament, what Christ is doing, in places like he talks in Matthew or Luke, that he's exposing the myth in Luke 11:50. The blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. That he's giving us the history of murder. He's exposing this history. He's saying, you're going to kill me, and you've always killed the prophets. This is what you've always done, and you're about to do it to me. And they carry this out. And then the irony is that people repeat this, not getting the message, that they say, let's get him. And then people say, let's get them, let's get the Jews. And missing the key, missing the entire message. That there should have been the exposure of this violence, but ironically, just as Jesus stood in the place and exposed this, if we don't get it, the danger is that this scapegoating continues. And again, in Girard's picture, it cannot ever, the full-blown scapegoating mechanism no longer works because of Christianity. But they're still scapegoated is in the plague, the Black Death. That would be the culmination of this. Thousands of Jews were slaughtered because, oh, well, those Jews. And of course, Girard's point is, yeah, they were scapegoated, but the mechanism in which it would be mythologized, it no longer functions.
Yeah, but we still participate in it, I think, is the danger.
The point, it's kind of maybe a vague point there. In other words, if you set the Jewish sacrifices in the history of the Jews and who they are as a people, and the fact that they too then have been scapegoated, then you go back and read about their sacrificial systems, what the prophets have to say about the sacrificial systems. I think Girard was early on, he was confused. He just thought, oh, the Jewish sacrifices are more of the same. And what my point would be, no, given if you put it in the proper context, we can say, no, that they themselves, the sacrifices, and your point with the scapegoat was exposing the very mechanism.
At least later, Girard, I don't think he would disagree. I think that's exactly where he ends up.
Frank, this has been wonderful. I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah, it's a good conversation, and I think this is pretty foundational, along with understanding the idea of resurrection and that what that really means, and combining it with this understanding of the systemic nature of sin. It really is what helps us understand what's happening in the world and why the kingdom of God is different and how it's different.
We can begin to live this thing out now. We can begin to live life differently, have a different order of experience.